I remember the silence more than the screams. Before steel struck steel. Before the sky filled with smoke. Before history decided what it would erase. There was a moment, brief, fragile, when the world seemed to hold its breath. The old chroniclers would later write that the gods had gone quiet that morning. No wind. No birds. No thunder. Even the fire burned without sound. Men noticed. They always do. But they marched anyway. Because empires rarely believe in endings, only in continuation. And that is how it always begins. I have seen empires rise like suns. I have also seen them set, slowly at first, then all at once. This one had ruled for generations. Its banners were known beyond the horizon. Its name alone could end rebellions before a sword was drawn. Children were taught that its victory was inevitable, written into the order of the world itself. The soldiers believed this. The generals believed it even more. They had won too many battles, crushed too many enemies, broken too many cities. Victory had become habit. Habit had become arrogance. And arrogance had become faith. Not faith in gods, but faith in themselves. They no longer asked if they would win, only how quickly. There were warnings. There are always warnings. A priest dreamed of a river running red for 3 days. A general's horse refused to cross the field where the army would later assemble. The night before the march, the moon disappeared behind a veil of cloud and did not return. Some soldiers whispered. Veterans always do. But the high command dismissed it all. Superstition, they said. Fear, they said. Signs invented by weak minds, they said. The empire had conquered fear long ago, or so it believed. And so the prophecy was not denied. It was ignored. That decision alone sealed everything that followed. Dawn came without color. The battlefield stretched wide and open, too open. A plain that invited confidence. The kind of terrain generals loved because it made maps feel honest. The enemy waited at the far end. Smaller, poorer, fewer banners. They should have broken by noon. That was the plan. What the empire did not see, what it refused to see, was not the enemy's formation, but their stillness. They were not afraid. They were waiting. I watched the first line advance. Armor gleaming. Banners high. Drums beating the rhythm of 1,000 previous victories. Each step forward felt justified by history. Each step forward pulled them deeper into the place where fate had been waiting far longer than they had. No one noticed the wind change. No one noticed the way sound carried strangely across the field. No one noticed the enemy's eyes. Because when you believe yourself chosen by destiny, you stop watching it. It happened quickly. It always does. A command was delayed. Just moments. The center advanced too far ahead of the flanks. A gap opened, not large, not obvious, but real. The enemy did not rush. They never do. They let the empire walk into it. That was the moment. The exact instant where history snapped into place. From then on, everything else was merely consequence. The signal came late. By the time it was corrected, the enemy had already moved. From the sides. From behind. From places the maps said were safe. The empire tried to adapt. It always had before. But this time, something was different. Fear had arrived. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that freezes. Men began to look around instead of forward. And an army that looks around is already broken. The sky darkened, not with storm, but with smoke. The field became a maze of fire and shadow. Commands vanished into the noise. Units fought without knowing who stood beside them. This was no longer a battle. It was a reckoning. I watched veterans drop their weapons, not because they were wounded, but because they finally understood. The empire was not losing. It was being ended. A standard fell. Just one. But it landed in the mud where everyone could see it. And when it did, something broke that could never be repaired. The belief. Empires are not held together by walls or armies. They are held together by belief. And when belief falls, everything else follows. The battle ended before sunset. Not because one side surrendered, but because one side ceased to exist as a force that mattered. The survivors fled. The victors did not pursue. They didn't need to. The empire would finish dying on its own. Cities would rebel. Provinces would fracture. Allies would disappear. History would later argue about dates. But everyone who stood on that field knew the truth. The empire died that day. It just hadn't stopped breathing yet. Some lived. They carried the story with them. They would tell it in whispers, years later, with eyes that still saw fire. Not because they were ashamed, but because they understood something the empire never did. There are moments when history cannot be negotiated with, only obeyed. You think this is a story about the past. It is not. It is a pattern. Empires still march with confidence. Generals still ignore warnings. Victories still breed blindness. The armor has changed. The banners look different. The battlefield wears new names. But fate remains patient. And it is always watching. The night before the battle, the camp was loud. Too loud. Laughter carried farther than it should have. Wine flowed freely. Veterans told stories they had told 100 times before. Stories where they survived, where the empire always prevailed, where the ending was known before the telling began. That is the danger of repeated victory. It convinces men that the future is a memory. I walked among them unseen, listening. One soldier sharpened his blade not because it needed it, but because ritual calmed his hands. Another wrote a letter home, already certain it would arrive. Officers argued over who would receive credit when the enemy collapsed. No one spoke of death. They had buried that word under decades of triumph. Above them, the sky watched. Clouds drifted without pattern. The stars appeared dull, distant, as if withdrawing. Even the fires seemed reluctant, their flames low and uneven, casting shadows that bent unnaturally against the tents. A scout returned late. He spoke quietly to his commander. Too quietly. The words did not travel far, but the fear behind them did. The enemy had moved during the night. Not closer, but wider. Spreading. Encircling the edges of the plain like a thought you try not to finish. The commander dismissed it. "They're afraid," he said. "They're retreating," he said. "They know tomorrow ends them," he said. And the men believed him. Because belief was easier than doubt. Dawn came slowly. Too slowly. The sun rose behind thin cloud, staining the horizon red, not gold, not white, but the color of old blood diluted by dust. I felt it then. The shift. Not panic. Not fear. Something colder. Certainty breaking. The army assembled with discipline born of long habit. Armor locked into place. Shields aligned. Commands repeated cleanly down the line. It looked perfect. That was the problem. Perfection has no flexibility. The enemy stood across the field, silent and unmoving. Their banners did not snap in the breeze. Their lines did not adjust. They looked less like an army, and more like a boundary, the kind you cross once, and never return from. The general rode the line one final time. He was brilliant. No chronicler would deny it. He had studied war the way priests study scripture. He knew every maneuver, every counter, every trick ever recorded. But knowledge has a weakness. It trusts itself too much. When a young officer spoke up, quietly, respectfully, the general did not shout him down. He did something worse. He smiled. "History is on our side," he said. That sentence has ended more civilizations than any enemy ever has. The officer fell silent, and the last chance to change course disappeared with him. The signal sounded. Drums rolled. The empire advanced. The ground trembled under tens of thousands of synchronized steps. Dust rose in thick clouds, partially obscuring the enemy. From a distance, it looked like dominance. Up close, it felt like walking into a held breath. The first clash was thunderous. Shields struck. Spears snapped. Men screamed. But something was wrong. The enemy did not push back. They gave ground too easily. Veterans noticed it immediately. This was not collapse. This was invitation. The empire pressed forward. Exactly as expected. Exactly as planned, by the other side. The center surged, driving deep into the enemy's line. Shouts of triumph rose. Officers signaled success. Messengers rode back with smiles already forming. Behind them, the flanks stretched thinner. Not enough to alarm. Just enough to matter. The enemy waited. And waiting, in war, is an act of faith. There is a point in every disaster where awareness arrives, not as knowledge, but as sensation. A tightening in the chest. A glance exchanged between soldiers who have fought too long to ignore instinct. I felt it ripple through the line. Men began to notice the silence again. Not absence of noise, but absence of chaos. The enemy still was not panicking. They were watching. And then, the horns sounded. Not from the front. From the sides. From behind. From places that should have been empty. The general reacted quickly. Too quickly. He ordered the reserves forward, to reinforce the center. The wrong place. The reserves moved as commanded, leaving the rear exposed. That was the second mistake. The first had been ignoring the warnings. The second made the first irreversible. History does not punish mistakes equally. Some are forgiven. Others are remembered forever. The enemy struck the flanks with precision. Not rage. Not desperation. Precision. Cavalry poured through gaps no one thought existed. Infantry locked shields and advanced inward, compressing the empire's formations until movement became impossible. Commands stopped traveling. Signals vanished into smoke. Officers shouted names that no longer answered. Men fought bravely. That is what makes the outcome tragic, not pathetic. Bravery cannot compensate for geometry. I saw it in their eyes. not fear. Understanding. They were not being beaten. They were being processed, like a force already accounted for, already defeated on someone else's map. Veterans dropped to one knee to reform ranks. The ranks never closed. New enemies appeared where none should have existed. And above it all, the sky darkened further. Not with clouds. With consequence. This is the part the legends remember incorrectly. They say the gods intervened. They did not. They simply stopped protecting. That is worse. When no lightning strikes, no miracles arrive, no signs appear, men are forced to face the truth alone. And the truth was this. The Empire had walked into a future it could no longer escape. Another standard fell. Then another. Each one hit the ground with a sound heavier than steel. Men stopped looking forward. They looked at the earth. At the bodies. At the gaps where friends had been. Cohesion dissolved. And when cohesion dies, an army becomes a crowd. Crowds do not survive battlefields. The general ordered a withdrawal. Too late. Not because retreat was impossible, but because belief was already gone. An army that no longer believes in itself does not retreat. It scatters. The order traveled halfway down the line and died. The rest never heard it. Or pretended not to. This was the moment. The one chronicler argue about centuries later. But those who stood there agree. This was when the empire ended. Not when the last soldier fell. Not when the capital burned. Here. On this field. When men stopped fighting for something bigger than survival. When history withdrew its permission. By midday, the battle was no longer organized. It was consumption. The enemy pressed inward methodically, dismantling pockets of resistance, closing escape routes, turning courage into exhaustion. The empire bled out slowly. Dignified. Hopeless. The sun climbed higher, indifferent. By sunset, the field belonged to the victors. But victory did not look triumphant. It looked necessary. Bodies lay where destiny had placed them hours earlier. Armor cooled. Fires smoldered without purpose. The enemy did not cheer. They knew what this meant. They had not just won a battle. They had rewritten the future. The survivors fled. Not as soldiers. Not as a unit. Not as an empire. They fled as shadows of the men they had once been. The battlefield swallowed them slowly, mud and blood clinging to armor, dragging them down as if the earth itself remembered their hubris. There was no order, only motion. Feet sank into soil, shields bent underweight, and yet none dared stop. To pause was to admit defeat, and defeat had already been written in every eye, every step, every ragged breath. And so they moved, leaving behind what they could not carry, banners, bodies, and the illusion of power. Some tried to rally. Voices rose above the moans, demanding courage, repeating old orders. But sound does not move armies broken from within. It scatters like smoke in a storm. The retreat was total, complete, inevitably tragic. I followed the generals from a distance, unseen yet witnessing every fracture. They had commanded continents, armies, empires. Men deferred to their judgment as if it were law. Now, law itself was meaningless. The generals argued with each other as the last rays of sun fell. Whose decision had failed? Whose command had doomed them? Whose arrogance had been greatest? No one spoke of strategy anymore. They spoke only of blame. And where blame grows, leadership dies. The men who survived the day carried scars invisible to the eye. The veterans knew something essential had been stripped from them: certainty. An empire marches not on armies alone, but on the belief that the world will obey its will. When belief fractures, no sword, no shield, no formation can compensate. I saw soldiers, those who had charged bravely that morning, sit in silence, staring at their hands as if waiting for them to restore what the gods had taken away. Some wept. Not for the dead. Not for the wounded. But for the future that would never come. The battlefield became hallowed in the absence of reverence. It was not blood alone that marked it. It was inevitability. Fate had carved a scar into the land itself. Centuries later, chroniclers would speak of omens: wind that whispered, trees bent unnaturally, rivers that refused to flow. The people called it cursed. Scholars called it coincidence. The empire called it history. But those who were there knew the truth. Some places exist only to remember the consequences of pride. Those who returned to their cities did not speak of victory. For no one had won. They had survived, yes. But survival was a hollow thing when the spirit of empire lay broken in mud and blood. Families waited for their sons, fathers, husbands. Some came back. Many did not. And the ones who returned carried stories so terrible that words themselves seemed insufficient. Even chroniclers trembled when recording them. "The empire is alive," they would write. "And yet it has already died." This is when history becomes legend. Not when the battle is fought, but when it is remembered. The first songs were written not to celebrate, but to mourn. The first statues were erected not in pride, but as warnings. And the first myths whispered among children were not about glory, but about inevitability. The empire had fallen, yes, but it fell in a way that ensured it would never truly be forgotten. Every subsequent general who studied the maps, every emperor who wondered about hubris, every soldier who dreamed of invincibility, all would be haunted by the memory of that day. The prophecy the generals had mocked was not wrong. It had been fulfilled. Not by God striking lightning. Not by magic or miracle. By men themselves. By confidence turned arrogance. By victory turned habit. By belief turned blindness. The gods did nothing. History did. And history, patient as always, watched as an empire that thought itself eternal was erased in a single day. Night fell. And with it came a silence far heavier than the mornings. The battlefield was quiet now, not because the fighting had ended, but because nothing remained to fight. The wind blew across the corpses and shattered banners. It carried the odor of smoke, blood, and inevitability. And in that silence, even the stars seemed to mourn. For one day, the empire had claimed the world. And by nightfall, the world had claimed the empire. Generations later, historians would debate numbers. Some would exaggerate losses, others would downplay them. But the truth is simple: the battle reshaped the world. Borders shifted. Alliances collapsed. Cultures changed course. And the lessons endured. They are the same lessons every empire learns, eventually. Arrogance is a battlefield. Certainty is fatal. Fate does not negotiate. Even today, when leaders study maps and armies, they see shadows of that day. The battlefield lives still, not in bodies, but in consequence. The battlefield was no longer the only place where death lingered. Cities fell into chaos. Provinces rebelled. Governors who had sworn loyalty vanished or declared themselves kings. Trade routes that once flowed like lifeblood were cut off, rivers of commerce turning into channels of rumor and fear. The empire, vast and proud, discovered something terrifying. It could still exist on maps, in decrees, in coins stamped with its name, but it could no longer exist in hearts or minds. Every town that once cheered its banners now whispered its failures. Every soldier who returned carried stories that eroded hope instead of pride. And in distant capitals, the ruling council debated endlessly, unable to restore the authority they no longer commanded. History is cruel in its patience. The empire discovered this slowly, province by province, city by city, moment by moment. Those who had survived the battlefield became legends of a bitter sort. Some were haunted by what they had done, or failed to do. Generals who had once commanded tens of thousands now wandered alone, cursed by indecision. Soldiers who had charged bravely were forever remembered for retreating when the formation broke. Stories spread, passed from village to village. The veteran who refused to fight again. The officer who warned too late. The warrior who abandoned his comrades. Each story carried the same lesson: bravery alone cannot defy destiny. The survivors' fates became intertwined with myth. Children grew up hearing their names whispered in fear and reverence. And long after the soldiers themselves had died, their actions, both heroic and tragic, shaped how the empire was remembered. With leadership fractured, chaos expanded like a living thing. Outlying regions, once obedient, declared independence. Mercenaries sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. Farms that had fed armies became battlegrounds for local lords. Rivers that carried wealth now carried refugees. The empire's vast wealth did not save it. Its walls could not hold it. Its armies could not defend it. And yet, in this chaos, small legends began to form. Tales of villagers defying raiders, of lone warriors holding bridges, of governors sacrificing themselves to protect towns, all became part of the tapestry. History began to weave myth into reality. Facts blended with stories. Battles became epic, retreats became heroic, and failure became inevitability dressed as prophecy. Even those who survived the battlefield could not trust each other. Old alliances crumbled. Officers who had once shared victories now accused one another of cowardice. Spies reported to rival provinces. Secrets that had been buried for generations surfaced. Internal rot devoured the empire faster than any enemy could. Where once loyalty had bound soldiers to their generals, fear and self-preservation now ruled. Every decision was second-guessed. Every command met suspicion. And through it all, the empire's name remained, a shadow of authority over land it no longer truly controlled. Historians would later speak of the fall, as if a single moment could contain it. But the empire's demise was mythic in scope. It unfolded across years, decades, and generations. Every battle lost after the Great Field reinforced the sense of inevitability. Every rebellion confirmed the prophecy that had been ignored. Every traitor whispered, "It was always written." People began to say that the gods themselves had abandoned the empire, not with lightning, but by allowing men to follow their hubris to destruction. And so the empire became legend. Not for the glory it had once claimed, but for the inevitability of its undoing. The banners, once symbols of might, became symbols of doom. Coins bore the faces of emperors long gone, but people spat on them as reminders of failure. Temples dedicated to victories now stood empty, haunted by ghosts of soldiers who would never return. Even the earth seemed to mark the empire's shame. Fertile plains became fallow, rivers ran slower, and trees bent strangely, casting shadows like warning hands. The land itself remembered, and those who walked it knew it. Amid the collapse, individual acts stood out. Some soldiers did what history would call impossible. They protected civilians, held bridges, delayed advancing enemy forces, or simply survived against impossible odds. These became legends within the larger legend of the empire. The captain who faced an entire battalion alone. The archer who fired until her bow snapped, saving a village. The general who chose honor over survival, dying where his men could escape. Their names echoed through stories, not because they changed history, but because their choices illustrated what humans could do when faced with inevitability. Even centuries later, the battle's memory shaped new empires. Generals studied it as a warning. Historians recounted it as a turning point. Poets wrote of it as prophecy fulfilled. Every empire that rose afterward carried the shadow of that fateful day, an invisible pressure, a reminder that no power is eternal. It is the weight of inevitability that defines history. And no empire, however mighty, is immune. The battle that ended the empire left lessons written not in tomes, but in scars. Arrogance is as lethal as any enemy. Habitual victory breeds blindness. Ignoring prophecy ensures its fulfillment. Leadership without humility is fragile. These truths were passed down, whispered from generation to generation, forming the foundation of legend. And with each telling, the empire grew both smaller in memory and larger in myth. The battlefield emptied, but the consequences followed every step of the survivors. Some wandered through ruined towns, carrying the weight of memories too heavy for words. Soldiers who had once been celebrated became ghosts. Their victories meaningless. Their courage irrelevant. Families did not recognize them. Communities feared them. The living could not reconcile their presence with the destruction they embodied. And yet, they survived. Survival became a burden heavier than death. The generals did not die in the field. They lived, but only in fragments. One fled to the mountains, commanding nothing but memories of what had been. Another stayed in the capital, writing endless dispatches, trying to shape a narrative he could no longer enforce. Their power had vanished. Their authority shattered. They were men once crowned in glory. Now they were men marked by inevitability. Every decision afterward carried the shadow of that fateful day. Every choice whispered, "Remember the day the gods turned away." It is here that the empire became legend. The battle, its mistakes, and its failures were repeated in song, story, and cautionary tale. Children grew up hearing how a single mistake destroyed an army. Historians debated endlessly why the empire fell, even though the reason was simple: human flaw amplified by fate. Priests and philosophers spoke of prophecy fulfilled, teaching that arrogance invites ruin. The lines between history and myth blurred. The empire became eternal, not in power, but in memory. History remembers heroes for victories. Legend remembers them for inevitability. In this story, some men acted with valor that could not alter fate. Some acted with cowardice that hastened ruin. Some betrayed, not from malice, but from understanding what could not be changed. Some sacrificed themselves so others might live. Every choice became a thread in the tapestry of inevitability. Even those who survived were bound by the narrative the battle wrote before a sword was drawn. Generations later, travelers walked the field and felt it. The earth still remembered. Shadows fell unnaturally. Winds whispered warnings to those who listened. It became a place of pilgrimage, not for pride, but for reflection. "Do not repeat their mistake," the land seemed to say. And history listened, silently, patient as ever. The gods did not intervene. Not with lightning. Not with miracles. Not with thunder. They did not need to. The empire had already walked the path destiny had prepared. The mortal arrogance, the ignored prophecy, the habitual victory, it had done their work. The gods, if they existed, watched silently. Fate, patient and relentless, had written the story. And the story concluded with no dispute. Every empire since has carried the weight of that day. Leaders who ignore warnings repeat the same mistakes. Armies that trust habit over observation fail. Victory without humility sows the seeds of inevitable defeat. The empire itself may be dust. Cities may crumble. Names may vanish from memory. But the story, the legend, remains. And in that story, the battle lives forever. Every strategist, every soldier, every empire is touched by it. Because inevitability, once set in motion, is patient. It waits. It watches. It shapes the world. The battle that ended an empire forever did more than destroy armies. It reshaped continents. It rewrote alliances. It redrew the map of human ambition. And it whispered, through the ages, to every mortal who dared to believe in certainty: pride is a battlefield. Habit is a trap. Ignored prophecy is a sentence. Fate waits for no one. Even now, if you close your eyes, You can hear the echoes of that day. The drums that began the march. The horns that signaled the trap. The cries of those who understood too late. And somewhere, in the wind that carries memory, the Empire still speaks. Not as rulers. Not as victors. Not as soldiers. But as warning. As legend.